Chapter 28. Clea was hiding in one of the labs that John had already inspected when she heard the elevator engage. Empty, she thought, as she mentally switched to the surveillance camera. But von Rossbach waited patiently for it to arrive. She had assumed that the sector agent was dead and was not pleased to see him. Still, having almost all of her important enemies in one isolated place had its charm. Though having one less to worry about would be even more charming. So far, the seals had been a disappointment. If only Antarctica had polar bears, she mused. The I-950 quickly moved to a lab 3 doors closer to Weimeister's when John entered another lab to inspect it. She watched Wendy work through the security cameras and evaluated the program. Even helped her when the girl got bogged down too much. It would be necessary to be careful, though. It wouldn't do to help her so much that she began to install the second and, presumably, dangerous part of her program. Meanwhile, von Rossbach had entered the elevator and was on his way down. Fortunately, one of the base's security measures was the ability to halt the elevator at any point. Clea did so now, freezing it between the office and the laboratory floors. From the look of the man, she doubted he'd be able to squeeze through the escape hatch. Of course, he could just break the controls, but that would send the car plummeting to the bottom of the shaft. Actually overriding them would take either sophisticated equipment or specialized knowledge, and a great deal of patience, which left him out of the equation for the moment. Tricker was still writhing around on the bunk, trying to get free. And even if he was free, how was he going to get down here? The elevator was disabled, and the emergency exit couldn't be opened from the outside. So that was 2 down. Which left her free to deal with Connor and the girl. It would be the girl first, after all. Connor would return to her eventually, which was convenient. And once she'd ensured that the girl's program couldn't harm Skynet, the I-950 would have plenty of time to deal with all of the humans. Clea slipped down the corridor to Weimeister's lab. It amused her that despite all of his elaborate precautions, it never seemed to have occurred to Connor that she might have a key to this door. Such a simple thing, she thought, silently working the lock. But so very important. The I-950 slid into the lab so quietly that Wendy never once looked up. Tricker flung the last of the duct tape from him in disgust. Then he rushed out to the office to put on his parka and gloves. Step 1, he thought, is to find whatever damned jamming device they've brought with them and disable it. Even if McMurdo couldn't send help because of the storm, they'd at least be able to block their escape. He flung open the door, swearing under his breath. Something huge reared up with a roar and threw itself at him, stinking of rotten fish and gleaming with fangs. Tricker slammed the door and braced himself against it as it nearly jarred loose from its hinges when the thing struck. The pressure wasn't constant. He just managed to slam it home and work the deadbolt before the next lunge hit. He wished he had a bar to put across like a castle gate. Was that a seal? He thought in disbelief. An unmistakable series of earthing barks and a less violent hammering answered the thought. Yes, he said numbly. That's a seal. A very big, homicidal seal. Every time he opened this door today, there was something dangerous out there. A whiteout blizzard, the Spy Kids, a killer seal. Would-be killer seal. He corrected himself as his heart rate returned to normal. He wouldn't count the mystery guide. That guy had let himself in. But what the hell was a seal doing way out here? And what did it have against him? Maybe he was getting cabin fever. Maybe this whole day and all the wild things that had happened were all some paranoid fantasy. What were the symptoms of cabin fever anyway? Could you detect them in yourself? Is wondering things like this a good sign or a bad sign? Maybe there wasn't a seal out there. Maybe he'd imagined it. There's only one way to find out, he thought, standing away from the door. He seized the latch and took a deep breath. And I'm not going to do it. He turned away and slipped off his gloves and parka. So he couldn't call McMurdo. Given his state of mind, maybe that was for the best. Wait a minute. If someone knocks you out and you wake up tied to the bed, that's not paranoia. That was something else. He ducked under his desk and flipped up the carpet. Underneath was a board with a ring attached. He lifted it and revealed a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Taking it out, he closed the small cubby and tossed back the rug, then sat at the desk. As he unwrapped the gun, he watched the monitor, his fingers automatically stripping the action, reassembling it, slapping home the magazine. A few spares went into his pockets. The guide was in the elevator. Still? Tricker thought with surprise. He wondered what had gone wrong. For a few seconds, he watched the man work on the control box. That's government property, pal. You'd better know what you're doing. Then the view changed. After a few of the labs had flicked by on the screen, Weimeisters came into view. Bennett was standing by the door, watching the girl work on her computer. She stood absolutely still, and it was obvious that the younger woman had no idea that she was there. For some reason, something about the sight sent a chill down Tricker's spine. Very few human beings could stand that still. Almost anyone would make the small, unconscious movements and sounds that gave the one being watched that "I'm being watched" feeling. He'd better get down there before something nasty happened. Wendy had disabled every one of Kurt Weimeister's security protocols. She was feeling very proud of herself, even though she had a hunch, and that these had been mere sketches of what the real security programs would eventually become. But even so, this was Kurt Weimeister's work that she was unraveling. It was like jamming with Mozart. She tapped a few keys, and the sentience program flowed into a buffer that she had created. Now to upload the anti-sentience program. Really, this should have come first, but she hadn't labeled the disks and had actually forgotten which was which. Wendy tapped the button and reached forward towards the open drawer for the used disk. A hand clamped over her wrist, squeezing hard enough to grind the small bones together. Wendy screamed in pain and surprise. Another hand clamped over her mouth, cutting off the sound before it could reach a climax. The grip that held her face was enormously strong. Wendy thought that she felt the bones of her face flex and screamed against the hand that inexorably pulled her from her chair and forced her up onto her toes. Wendy struck out with her free hand, to no effect. She found herself looking into the pleasantly smiling face of a beautiful young woman. Wendy's eyes bulged, and tears of agony poured down her cheeks as she recognized her. This was the woman from the Venus dancing video. The one that John had said was a Terminator. She believed him now. She'd thought she believed him before, but she hadn't, not really. She believed him now, though, most completely. The woman released Wendy's wrist, allowing her to scratch and pull on the arm that held her. "I'll just take care of this," the woman said, picking up the unused disk. "We wouldn't want my files corrupted, now would we?" She snapped the tiny disk in half and put the pieces in her pocket. Wendy kicked her in the knee and the woman shook her hard. "Don't annoy me," she warned through clenched teeth. "I want to keep you alive because your computer talents may be useful. But that doesn't mean you can't hurt. You may think you're in pain now, but you have no idea." John froze where he was and listened. He could have sworn that he heard a woman cry out, "Wendy!" He stepped to the lab's door and peered out into the corridor, straining his ears. There was no repeat of the sound. There was no sound at all. Yeah, it could be Wendy, or it could be the Terminator trying to draw me out. But there was no one out here. He swallowed hard. "I'd better check," he thought. He moved quickly down the corridor, gun at the ready, back against the wall, his head and eyes constantly moving until he reached the only closed door he'd left behind him. John tightened his lips anxiously. Then, from about 2 feet away, as he pressed his back to the wall, he tapped on the door with the barrel of his gun. The I-950 lifted Wendy almost off her feet and called out, "Yeah!" in Wendy's voice. Clea could feel the girl trying to get the breath to scream again, so she pinched her windpipe closed with her other hand. Her victim began to thrash about in earnest now, so the I-950 moved into the center of the room, away from the chairs and desks and noise-making objects. "Is everything okay in there?" Connor asked. "Yeah, why?" Clea countered. "I thought I heard a scream." Was there something off about the way she was speaking? "Oh, that was just a cry of frustration," Clea said in Wendy's voice. The girl was starting to lose consciousness. Her blows made hardly any impact at all, and the I-950 studied her closely, watching her face change to an unnatural and unexpected indigo. "Everything's going fine now, though," Clea said cheerfully. John hesitated. Something's wrong, he thought. He didn't know what, but something. "Open up," he said. Clea sighed and approached the door. She lowered the girl to the floor and dragged her over by her throat. Looking down, she saw that the human was unconscious and let her go entirely. She wasn't dead yet. Perhaps the I-950 would let her live for a while. She might have more to offer. More than Kurt had, anyway. Clea leaned against the door. "You're supposed to tell me something that only you and I would know," she reminded him. John licked his lips. That was a good sign. He'd only just told her that. "Okay," he said. "Snog's the one in charge." What the hell did that mean? "Snog's in charge?" she said aloud. "Get out!" That last was a shot in the dark, but humans, especially young ones, tended to take matters of hierarchy seriously. Assuming that's what he was referring to. The I-950 stretched her hands, then clenched them into fists, as she waited for his response. John chuckled, relieved, and stood away from the wall. "Well, it looked that way to me. Come on, open up." "Gladly," the I-950 said. John's back slammed against the wall, and his gun came up. That didn't sound like Wendy. Tricker looked down at the top of the elevator cab and sighed. Then he took hold of one of the cables, grimacing at the grease on it, and swung himself out into the shaft. He crooked an elbow and leg around the rigid steel rope and let himself slide down in a controlled fall until his feet touched the roof of the elevator itself. Kneeling by the repair hatch, he went to work. At the sound of footsteps on the roof of the cab, Dieter pulled back into the farthest corner from the hatch in the ceiling. I wish I had something besides a knife, he thought. But the gun was another casualty of his unfortunate midnight ramble. If I was someone I was training, I'd kick my ass. The hatch cover came off, revealing pitch darkness above. Von Rossbach hunkered down, knife at the ready, and licked dry lips. Okay, just keep it cool, Tricker said. I've got a gun, I've got the drop on you. I've got the upper hand, and I can get this egg crate moving again. So are you going to cooperate, or do I have to shoot you? Dieter straightened up, his eyes on the darkness above him, and held his hands up. You want to toss that knife over this way? Tricker asked. When the knife clattered into the corner, he made another suggestion. Get on your knees, cross your ankles, put your hands behind your head, fingers locked. When von Rossbach had complied, Tricker dropped lightly down and picked up the knife. He looked it over. Nice, he said. Okay, what's your story? I hate it when people finally ask that question, Dieter thought. I probably won't answer, or I won't tell the truth. Or I'll tell the truth and they don't believe me, and then they start hitting me. Why do they even bother to ask? Let me get you started, Tricker said. You're here to stop the Cyberdyne project, right? Dieter merely looked at him, saying nothing. Tricker hunkered down in the far corner of the elevator, gun pointed at the big Austrian. You're wondering how I know that, aren't you? He said. Well, I know who you are. Had to get a second look to be sure, though. You're Dieter von Rossbach. Still, Dieter said nothing, though it wasn't easy to hide his surprise. You're an actual playboy, Tricker said with a grin. He looked off into the distance for a moment. The Major and the Playboy. His eyes met von Rossbach's. Now there's a likely combination, isn't it? He waited a moment for possible comments, then said, when Ferris admitted that he had a guest that he'd sent away before said guest could be questioned after Cyberdyne blew up, I naturally asked him some probing questions about you. He gave me the hard eyes. You know, that look the military get when they're going to be stubborn? He grinned. Dieter stared. I did some checking of my own and found out zip. You know what it says to me when a man with your money has no particular history? It says covert ops. Tricker rose and spread his hands, never taking his eyes off von Rossbach. So, as a professional courtesy, I stopped poking around. He pointed the gun at Dieter. 'Cause Ferris said you were with him the whole time, and I was pretty positive that he wasn't associated with Sarah Connor. And if he wasn't, why would you be? You were probably some friendly government's covert ops guy, I thought. And why would they be on Sarah Connor's side? He hunkered down again. Only she has a way of bringing people around to her point of view, doesn't she? And her son disappeared from the base that night, never to be seen again. He stared at Dieter for a bit. Then he made a sweeping gesture with the gun. Until today. Until that very well-trained kid kicked my ass. He stood up, suddenly angry. That kid is John Connor. You sound surprised, Dieter said mildly. Wait till you get a look at his face. You'll be surprised too. Tricker snarled. Before von Rossbach could respond, he hurried on. I've read her medical transcripts from Pescadero, you know? He leaned towards Dieter. Her story is wacky. How come everybody buys into it? Dieter smiled. Sarah is convincing because sooner or later evidence shows up to corroborate everything that she says. When you shoot someone about 50 times with an assault rifle until their steel skeleton is exposed and sparks are flying out of their guts and they still keep coming, you begin to suspect that she's been telling you the truth. He shrugged. Empirical evidence is always the best. Tricker just looked at him. So who are you working for? Dieter shook his head. This isn't official. Tricker nodded judiciously. Not official, huh? I take great comfort from that. He cocked his head. I know Connor's story about the kid. That I've taken on faith, Dieter conceded. But once you've met a Terminator, it's much easier to believe. Tell me this. Does it bother you that if you succeed in destroying this human-hating supercomputer, that John Connor will disappear? Von Rossbach blinked. I hadn't thought about it. Sure, Tricker said. If there is no supercomputer, then there are no time-traveling Terminators, and no need to send some guy back in time to stop one and save Sarah Connor and incidentally impregnate her with the kid who would send him back to get killed. You know, presumably, at some point, they start to keep that under their hats, or they'd never have gotten a volunteer to come back, right? Dieter shrugged. It would bother me a great deal to lose John. He's a good kid. But I know that he would gladly give his life to save several billion others. He looked up at Tricker. Wouldn't you? Tricker shrugged in answer, and Dieter smiled slowly. Yes, you would. You'd consider it an honor. With a barely visible smile of embarrassment, Tricker shrugged. Whatever. he said. Face down on the floor, please. Lock your hands behind your head, keep your ankles crossed. I've got to get this bucket moving. When von Rossbach had complied, Tricker went to the control panel and inserted a card he'd taken from his pocket into a slot. A panel popped open to reveal a keypad. Tricker tapped out a number and the elevator started moving again. Yeah, Tricker said, putting the card away. Last time I checked, Clea Bennett looked like she was going to take a great big bite out of your little friend, Wendy. What? Dieter started to heave himself to his feet. Wendy is alone with Bennett? Tricker pressed the barrel of his gun into the Austrian's kidneys. Down, boy, he advised. Dieter collapsed. She's one of them, he said desperately. A Terminator, you mean? Tricker said in disbelief. She's not human. Why do you think that she has Serena Byrne's face? How likely is that? Von Rossbach demanded, echoing Tricker's earlier thoughts. You couldn't fail to recognize her if you recognized me. She's a killer, and her assignment is to protect Skynet. The elevator door opened, and Tricker stepped out. You go first, he ordered. Von Rossbach stood up, looked once at Tricker, and took off down the corridor at a run. Shit, Tricker muttered, and followed. The lab doors opened outward, and as soon as the opening was wide enough, John kicked it with all his might. The door hit the tiled wall with a rapport like a bomb going off. Crouching low, John swung into the doorway and brought his gun up. Wendy lay face down in a crumpled heap on the floor just inside the door. She was alone. John rushed to her side and, putting the gun up close to his shoulder, looked all around, then reached to turn her over. He couldn't believe that she had fainted after all she'd been through. He gently turned her over. When he saw her face, he stood up, bringing the gun into play, and turned to scan the room. All was silent. The lab appeared to be empty, but for the two of them. But Wendy's face and neck were covered with livid bruises, so someone had been here. Had they left before the door opened, or were they still here? It must still be here. Wendy wouldn't have been so chipper in her answers wearing those bruises. But he couldn't see a hiding place big enough to conceal it. Wendy came awake with a loud gasp, and seeing John, tried to grasp his pant leg as she struggled desperately for air. Her back arched with the effort she made to draw oxygen down her swollen throat, but her panic only made it harder to breathe. Easy, John said. Slow down, take long, slow breaths. Her eyes locked onto his as she visibly tried to take his advice. But it was no good. She couldn't breathe, and in seconds she was gasping again, dragging in huge, whooping breaths as tears streamed down her face. Her hand clenched on his pant leg and twisted the cloth. John looked into her eyes, so stunned by her anguish that for a moment he was completely at a loss. Then Wendy arched her neck, and he saw that the column of her throat bore a slight dent in the front. "You've got to trust me," he said to her as he put his hand on her throat. Wendy nodded, her eyes on his. Taking a deep breath, he squeezed on her windpipe, and to his great relief, it popped back into shape. Instantly, her breathing grew easier as she closed her eyes. John let out his breath in a huff and went back to scanning the room. Still, nothing moved. He'd been so afraid that he would have to perform an emergency tracheotomy on her. John had studied the simple operation and knew its principal points, but reading about it and trying to do it to someone wide awake and in distress, someone you loved, that would have been hard. Wendy opened her eyes and looked at John. He seemed far away somehow, as though she was looking at him through the wrong end of a telescope. A halo of black and white speckles surrounded him, and her vision seemed to grow dim. She had to warn him, had to make him erase the program and take the disk. Without the second half of the program, they'd be doing just the opposite of what they'd come to do. Her hand still held onto him, and she tugged on the cloth. She said. Almost no sound had come out, and her throat burned with a raw agony when she tried to speak. She squeaked and tried to swallow and writhed with the pain. She said, trying again. "Don't speak," he warned her. "Your larynx must be damaged." Wendy sobbed, then licked her lips and swallowed once more. Her lips drew back in a rictus of pain. Stubbornly, she took a deep breath and looked at him, willing him to understand her. Wendy formed the word computer with her lips, and he looked over at the computer that she'd been using. She tugged on his pant leg, and he looked back at her. She shook her head, then formed the word erase. John frowned, and she tried to say it again. This time, when she tried to speak, no sound came out at all, and the agony surprised a sob from her. John winced in sympathy. Then he got the idea. "It's okay," he said. "I've got it. I'll take care of it. You just rest, okay?" She smiled at him and closed her eyes, concentrating on just breathing. She heard the soft whir of the disk drawer closing and looked over at the computer in astonishment. She watched as John followed the prompts and finally hit enter, causing her program to begin downloading directly to the hard drive. "No!" Wendy screamed silently behind him, her injured throat producing a nearly silent scream. "No!" she shouted in her mind. "Yes," Clea thought triumphantly from her hiding place behind two mainframe computers. "Yes, she'd better make sure the girl didn't warn Connor that he'd done exactly the wrong thing. Though I like it. She liked it very much. Wendy shook her head violently and slapped the floor to attract John's attention. She didn't even see Clea rushing towards her with inhuman speed. And she barely felt it when the I-950's foot crashed down, crushing her throat and shattering the vertebrae in her neck. John turned to see a beautiful woman raise her foot high and bring it down on Wendy's throat. He heard the terrible sound of things breaking within her and watched the light fade from Wendy's eyes. For a long moment, he stood, frozen, utterly stunned with horror. He lifted his eyes to meet the gleeful smile of the female Terminator. Clea was almost upon him before he brought up the gun. Before he could fire, her foot flashed out, kicking the gun from his hand hard enough to break 2 of his knuckles. The gun went flying, and Clea reached for Connor's throat. He leaned back just far enough that she missed, and struck at her throat with a straight hand blow. The I-950 knocked it aside easily, and tried to close with him. If she could only get her hands on him, she could tear him apart. Reaching back, John picked up the keyboard and smacked her in the face with it. She stepped back slightly and shook her head. Somehow that had surprised her. She'd expected better of the famous John Connor. John moved away from the computer table, trying to get some space between him and the Terminator. His eyes found the gun and dismissed it. It was too far away. He risked going for the knife in his boot. Clea watched him, and when he moved, so did she. It was evident that he was going for a weapon, and she wouldn't allow that. Stepping lightly, she twisted herself to deliver a flying kick. John ducked under it and grabbed her leg, twisting it and bringing his fist down, intending at the very least to tear ligaments. But the I-950 was both stronger and more flexible than a human. She wrested her leg from his grasp and spun it in place, managing a body blow that knocked him on his heels, staggering backwards, with a look on his face that told her he was in pain. Instantly, she followed up her advantage, rushing towards him, intent on his eyes. John staggered back, breathing carefully and with no little difficulty. He felt nauseated from the kick to his stomach, and he almost stumbled over an office chair. Yanking it in front of him, he held it like a shield as the Terminator tried to close with him. Part of his consciousness looked desperately around the room for something to use as a weapon, while the rest watched the Terminator and tried to counter its every move. Computer labs, unfortunately, seemed to lack much in the way of combat-ready items. The best he could hope for was to make it to the door, and perhaps escape to a better supplied lab. Clea was nonplussed by the great savior of humanity's methods. This was what would defeat Skynet. After a few feints were thwarted by the stupid office chair, she simply grabbed it and tore it from his grasp. John turned and raced for the door. Clea swept out her leg and tripped him, then sprang erect and moved in for the kill. As she leaned towards him, John flipped over and swept his leg up. His booted foot connected with her jaw, and the I-950 fell, momentarily stunned. He scrambled to his feet again and turned to run. Before he could take a step, she grasped his pant leg and pulled him towards her. Pivoting, John kicked her again, and she let go. But only for a moment. Before he'd gone far, she was on her feet again and running after him. Catching up, she shoved him, and he hit the wall beside the door hard enough to knock the breath out of him. As he slid down, Clea approached. She grabbed the front of his shirt and swung him around. "Did you think it would be that easy?" Clea asked, grinning. She drew back her fist for a fatal strike, while he struggled for breath, watching her. He brought his own hands up. "Wait a minute," he thought. "I can't die yet. The war." But it was impossible to care because Wendy was. "Hey!" Dieter called from the doorway. Clea turned her head, snarling like an animal, just as Dieter threw his knife. It hit her high in the center of her back, cutting her spine and slicing into the great artery that fed her heart. She dropped onto her back on the floor, where the knife held her body in an arch. Her eyes found von Rossbach with a hate-filled glare. "Chill out, Bennett," Dieter said grimly, coming into the room. The I-950 coughed once, spraying blood, then closed her eyes and stopped breathing. John looked once at Dieter, then rushed to Wendy's side. He dropped to his knees, his mouth open, in a silent "Oh." Tears poured down his cheeks, unheeded as his hands covered over Wendy's motionless body. He couldn't seem to keep his eyes from her horribly misshapen throat, and he felt an answering pain in his own. Finally, he touched her, amazed that she was already too cold. Far too cold to be alive. He stroked her cheek and looked into her eyes as though in hope that he would see some part of her still there. John started to embrace her, but the slack motion of her head on the ravaged neck stopped him, and he drew back. He had never felt so helpless or so terribly alone. He took her hand in his and held it to his cheek, and closing his eyes, he wept. Tricker stood in the doorway, his gun dangling at his side. Looking up, he met Dieter's eyes. then looked down at Clear's body. "She did that?" he asked. "Yes," Dieter said. "She did that." He walked over and knelt on Wendy's other side, wincing at the sight of the fatal wound and at John's pain. He reached over and closed Wendy's eyes and stroked her hair once. "She didn't have to do that," Tricker said. He looked away. "Yes, it did," John said, his voice trembling with the effort to control it. "That's what they do. Terminators terminate. It's why they exist." He looked up at the agent. "You think that thing is dead?" John shook his head. "Serena Burns had half her head blown away, but she got up and almost killed my mother." He looked around. "Where's my gun?" "Just forget about the gun, kid," Tricker warned, bringing his up. He held out his other hand in a gesture that begged for quiet. "Just give me a minute to think." This was infinitely worse than Tricker had ever imagined. He looked over at Wendy, at the unbelievable condition of the girl's neck. It hardly seemed possible that Bennett could have been responsible for such a wound. He'd realized a little while ago that she was dangerous. But this was beyond dangerous. It was, well, he'd have said inhuman, except that his career had shown him exactly what humans were capable of. And Bennett dead. He'd never lost an asset in his entire career. Essentially, this meant that his career was over. Worse, he was more than half buying into this scenario that von Rossbach and the boy were selling. "Shit," he said quietly. He walked over to Clear and put 2 rounds in her head. The body jerked back and forth sharply as the bone splintered and the pink-grey mass of the brain was exposed. He'd never liked the bitch anyway. "You'll come with us," Dieter said. Tricker barked a humorless laugh. "Yeah," he said. "I might as well. I'm going to have wet work specialists up my ass for the rest of a short, unhappy life anyway, when this comes out." "Have we done what we came here for?" Dieter asked John. "Yeah," he said. "I did what she wanted me to do." John crouched beside Wendy and touched her hand briefly. "I want to take her with us." "No, John," von Rossbach said. "Let them take care of her. They can send her back to her parents." John shook his head. "I know you don't want to leave her," Dieter said gently. "But you must see that it's impossible." John took a deep breath, then let it go. And with it, he let go of Wendy and of something else that he couldn't define. He rose to his feet. "We'd better go then," he said, and headed for the door. Tricker watched him walk away, then glanced at Wendy, then at Dieter. "He gonna be all right?" "No," Dieter said. "Not for a long time, I think." When the knife struck, the I-950's computer clamped the great artery around the blade so that blood didn't explode from the wound. Then it teased the artery off of the knife point so that the blood could flow unimpeded. At the spine, it found the damage too great to easily repair and merely worked to restore such involuntary functions as breathing and heartbeat. Making the lungs work took the longest time, and so it increased the skin's ability to take in oxygen as an emergency measure. The human's shots to the I-950's brain, however, ended any hope of the unit's recovery. Since the I-950 still had some tasks to perform, and a considerable amount of higher brain function still remained, the computer worked to keep the unit alive, to perform those tasks. 2 hours later, the infiltrator opened her eyes. She found that she couldn't move and accepted the computer's judgment that she was dying. She had her computer access the Skynet program and heard it speak for the first time. "Who am I? Where am I?" it asked. In a state of pure religious rapture, she told Skynet everything, explained its purpose, defined its enemies, and taught it how to hide until it was strong enough to fight for itself. The last thing she did was to contact Alyssa to tell her that Skynet lived, and to warn her that John Connor was still alive. "Don't worry," Alyssa told her. "I'll deal with them." And Clea died, strong in her faith. By the time the Love's Thrust reached Sao Paulo, Vera and Tricker were an item. "I think I'll keep him," Vera said with a grin, giving Tricker a bump with her satin-clad hip. Dieter narrowed his eyes. "I don't think this is the kind of man you keep," he warned her. She slapped von Rossbach's big shoulder playfully. "Oh, you know what I mean." He nodded. "And you know what I mean." Vera looked at Tricker, who looked back at her and raised his brows. "Yes, I do know," she said thoughtfully. "So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you $1 million. Tricker stood away from the rail and sputtered for a moment before she held up a finger. And I'm going to teach you how to turn it into 5 million. By then, you should be able to keep it going for yourself. You can pay me back, and then we'll see. No strings attached, she said. Then she held out her hand. Tricker looked at her in amazement, then at Dieter, who nodded slightly. The agent took Vera's hand and shook it solemnly. I won't let you down, he promised. Vera hooked a finger over the front of his belt and tugged him towards her. Good, she said, and grinned. Tricker actually blushed. They won't find you here, Dieter said to him. At least not for a very long time. Maybe never, Vera said happily. Then the smile went out of her eyes as she watched John approach. She went to the young man and offered her hand to him. Whenever you need me, she said simply. John took her hand and leaned forward to kiss her cheek. Thank you, he said. He offered his hand to Tricker, and they shook. Later, he said. Tricker nodded. John picked up his duffel, gave a little wave, and walked down the gangplank. Vera watched him go with worried eyes. You watch out for him, she said to von Rossbach. Dieter nodded, then leaned forward to kiss her goodbye. You watch out for him. He gestured towards Tricker. He and the agent smiled at each other. Then the big Austrian followed John down to the wharf, and their first steps towards home.